Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. You're listening to the Bloomberg Intelligence Podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 10 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
We are data dependent, and we got that UMich number, that final read.
So let's go to Joanne Hsu. Surveys of consumers director for the University of Michigan. University of Michigan sentiment came out 71.1. The consensus was 73.2. Joanne, what does the data tell you here?
Consumers are really not sure about what's going to be going on in the future, particularly with this administration change. We're, of course, seeing partisan differences. Republicans are feeling pretty optimistic about the future, Democrats less so. And this is really coming down to a difference in opinion about what Trump's anticipated policies are going to result in for the economy.
What about the inflation expectations? Like, what kind of changes did we see there? Because, of course, we're all waiting to see if tariffs do come down, will they wind up being inflationary?
So inflation expectations for the short run, they surged quite a bit between December and January, and they went up as well for the long run, 3.0 in December, 3.2 this month. Consumers are really quite concerned about tariffs, and actually concerned in different ways. Democrats, people who believe that tariffs are better for the economy, they think that inflation is going to plummet. People who think that tariffs are bad for the economy, they think that inflation is going to come surging back. So overall, consumers have already incorporated expected tariffs into their economic attitudes.
All right, Joanne, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Joanne Hsu, surveys of consumers, director for the University of Michigan. Again, University of Michigan headline number came out, sentiment number 71.1 was the actual. The consensus was 73.2, and it was 73.2 in the prior period. So as Joanne was saying, some concern out there, perhaps about some changes in economic policies, at least initially.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Intelligence Podcast. Catch the program live weekdays at 10 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Alix and Paul Sweeney live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, streaming live on YouTube as well. The easiest way to find it, I found, is just go to youtube.com. Search Bloomberg Podcast Live, and it comes right up. So how tough is that? It is Friday, which means we talk to one B. Ritholtz, Barry Ritholtz. He does this podcast thing. I think it's kind of popular. The host of Masters in Business on Bloomberg Radio is also the founder of Ritholtz Wealth Management. Barry, make America great again. One could look at the economic data and say, country's doing pretty well. How do you think about it?
Yeah, this is the second time President Trump, first in 2017, now in 2025, inherited a really robust economy. So we'll just look at the previous year. And when you look at his first term, the worst effects of the financial crisis had faded. Things had been on the upswing, at least enough for President Obama to get reelected in 2012. By 2016, we were really flying. The market was at a new all-time high, and the economy was doing pretty well. Here we are, 2025. 2024 GDP is going to be pretty close to 3% for the year. Unemployment is at 4.1%. That's close to full employment. Inflation is back under 3%, heading towards 2%. We can argue if 2% is a credible inflation target in a fiscal stimulus environment, but 2.7% headline CPI. Wages are higher. Markets are at record highs. Corporate profits are at record highs. I could make the case that America is already, at least economically speaking, pretty great.
Right. So that makes me feel two things. One, either freaked out that there's only room for downside, or two, well, then you add on, say, deregulation, and you add on lower taxes, and we're going to see some better times too.
So first, it's very hard to say the economy is doing really well, and like a person who's enjoyed a great, healthy, long lifespan, they don't just suddenly roll over and die. The economies don't just trip and face plant, at least not developed large economies like the U.S. So, I have coming up in a week or so, Torsten Slok from Apollo Global Management.
Yeah, we were both big fans.
And he puts the risk of recession at 0%. Listen, I don't put anything at 0%, but a meteor that killed the dinosaurs, there's more than a 0% chance that happens this weekend. But it's close to 0%. So I think what he's trying to say is this economy is firing on all cylinders. Wherever you look, there is strength. And if you look at how poorly the rest of the economists' world have done over the past few years, consistently forecasting recession, slowdown, I think they underestimate the strength of the U.S. economy. If you look around, we are suffering from labor shortages, housing shortages, automobile shortages. That's a big driving factor in preventing any sort of softness to happen, because anytime a new house gets built, it gets bought up right away. Anytime there are qualified people in a labor pool, they get hired right away. And so it's to say nothing of all of the positive activity we've seen over the past few years, not just AI, but data centers and software and technology. Those things tend to have momentum and they tend to persist. That's not a week-to-week or month-to-month economic factor. Those are drivers that can last years and years, almost a decade. So we just have a lot of economic tailwinds behind us, and people have just been way too negative. That's before we get to the positives. And this administration is potentially a mixed bag. There are risks and opportunities. But from a market perspective, there certainly are a lot of opportunities coming.
Barry, are you concerned at all about potential headwinds coming from either tariffs or material changes to immigration policy that may be inflationary, that may harm the labor market, any of those types of things?
Yeah, everything comes down to interest rates. All the risk. So there are risky policies from the Trump administration, and there are opportunistic policies from Trump 2.0. The risky policies all come down to interest rates. The wild card factor of geopolitics. I have no idea what he's going to do with China, Russia, the Middle East. Risk of, let's not even talk about war, just disruption is problematic. I don't know how else to describe tariffs other than a price increase paid for by domestic consumers. The Fed has talked about tariffs as inflationary and potentially preventing even more rate decreases. And when Trump actually made his presentation at Davos, he not only called on lower oil prices from OPEC, he called for lower rates from all the central banks around the world. Well, we import a ton of oil and petroleum products from Canada. If you're going to slap a 10 or a 20% level rate on that, guess what? That's going to be inflationary. So I'm a little concerned about this. My wishful thinking is, hey, this is a negotiating tactic. And to be fair, much of the tariffs around the world are not even-handed. You cannot have a 10, 20, 30% tariff on U.S. goods, and it's less manufactured goods than it is agricultural or all the energy we're exporting, liquefied natural gas, as well as various forms of petroleum. There needs to be some fairness and parity. So while many of my friends on the left scream about, oh, this is going to be terrible, hey, there's a case to be made. There's a reasonable negotiation to get some fairness. It has to be a two-way street. It can't just be American consumers, wealthy though they are, paying most of the tariffs in the world. That doesn't seem to be fair. Hopefully, we can get some positive resolution to the tariff question.
So, and then it all brings back to sequencing, right? Like tariffs will probably hit faster than maybe deregulation and corporate taxes, but the sequencing may not matter if we know that, say, deregulation and corporate taxes are coming. Is that a fair assessment?
That's a really interesting question, because I have no idea of what the sequencing is going to be like. Anything that's going to require Congress is going to take longer. But a perfect example, the FTC under President Biden was pretty aggressive in restraining M&A activity. I mean, to be fair, the FTC has been asleep at the switch for 3 decades and have allowed an intense concentration of corporate power. Anyone who's bought a concert ticket knows how ridiculous the Live Nation Ticketmaster merger was allowed. And you could say the same thing about a lot of other technology mergers that have been allowed. There's far fewer healthcare companies, far fewer energy companies. It's really become a little bit of a corporatocracy. But a defanged FTC is going to allow more M&A activity. Generally, that's supportive of higher market prices. There'll be no scrutiny on stock buybacks. So that tends to support higher prices. The IPO market's been pretty dead for a few years. That's going to start coming back to life, as well as secondaries, to say nothing of the deregulation to specific sectors. So think about healthcare and energy. It's hard to imagine. We've been producing record amounts of oil in the United States the past few years. They're going to open up even more areas. Now the politics of that is a little bit divisive, but just being cold-blooded and looking at it from an economic perspective, hey, more energy means lower, more petroleum means lower oil prices, which is anti-inflationary. Same with materials. Energy and materials were 2 of the worst sectors last year. Maybe they catch a bit.
Barry, real quick, what are you driving this weekend?
In this weather, the
Yes.
truck, I'm gonna be out in something with heated seats and a heated steering wheel, and I don't really care about handling or I'm looking out my home office window. Everything is still snowed over, still iced over, and the thermostat says we're still in the teens. Hopefully by Sunday we'll get out of this deep freeze and I could take something out. Like any of the fun cars, their tires are just terrible in 20-degree weather. They have no grip.
All right.
Well, also, though, teens is kind of a heat wave. So at this point, look at it that way.
We're getting up to the 30s on Sunday, so we're looking
I mean, that's like bathing suit weather. Barry, we appreciate you. Thank you very much. Barry Ritholtz, founder and CEO of Ritholtz Wealth Management.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Intelligence Podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 10 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Let's get right to our next guest. Gautam Mukunda has been kind enough to chat with us over the last several months, give us his thoughts on what's happening down in Washington, D.C. He's a professor at the Yale School of Management. Gautam, thanks so much for joining us here. I know you listened to President Trump make some comments here. What are your initial thoughts here of these first several days of President Trump's second administration here as he hits the ground, seemingly running?
Yeah, I mean, it's a mixture. He's definitely hitting the ground running in some ways. So there's some element of the rhetorical gestures that don't kind of mean a lot and are characteristically Trumpian, right? He's renaming the Gulf of Mexico and the Mount Denali and things like that. Okay, fine. I mean, whatever. There are a bunch of executive orders, some of which are pretty standard, some of which are not necessarily what they seem. The one on tariffs, for example, basically says that the Secretary of Commerce will consult, which isn't the same thing as levying them massively. So we'll see what happens on that next. And then there's a bunch of stuff that is going to do a lot of long-term damage, but the effects may not be seen right away. The United States withdrawing from the World Health Organization. I think we had a pretty dramatic example quite recently about the importance of global public health. So, we might worry about the effects of that. The U.S. pulling out of climate change agreements. Those things are going to do a lot of harm, but it may not be perceptible in the next year or two, or even the next 4 or 5 years. That might be a problem for the successor.
Exactly, which brings me to my next question, and we were talking about this earlier, is what is the sequencing? Because that matters, right? If you have deregulation and you have tax cuts, that's obviously going to be positive. It feels like the equity market's really focused on that versus, say, the tariff issue, which could come actually earlier maybe than we think, but doesn't have a lot of clarity. What's your sequencing modeling?
So the sequencing, a lot depends on the Republican Congress and the Republican caucus in the House, which at the moment is sitting on a 1-seat margin. So herding cats is easy compared to what they're going to try to do here. And in particular, the tax cuts, things like that, all that is also going to revolve around the debt ceiling increase, which will almost certainly need Democratic help. So there are going to be some significant tax cuts that will be slanted towards corporations, the wealthy. There's going to be massive deregulation in ways that will be very, very favorable to corporate interests. Like that is an inevitability with Trump. But the sequencing is completely up in the air and depends on, getting essentially every single Republican member of Congress to agree on a policy agenda. Good luck. I'd rather not. If somebody offered me that job, I wouldn't want to take it.
Gautam, one of the more near-term issues that needs to be addressed by the Trump administration is getting some of their cabinet nominees confirmed. They've made some major headway with Secretary Rubio, but still some contentious ones to come with Mr. Hegseth, RFK Jr., Tulsi Gabbard, to name three. How do you expect this to play out?
Yeah, so Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski have said that they're not voting for Pete Hegseth. So we're basically down to they'd have to lose two more Republican senators. The most likely person to flip at this point is Mitch McConnell. After that, I don't really see a fourth. So my guess is he's going to get all of these people through. And that, in particular, you think about Hegseth, Gabbard to a lesser extent, but Kash Patel of the FBI. These are people for whom there is no argument that these are people who should be running these agencies, right? That there is no sense that they're qualified to do so. There is nothing in their background that makes it seem like they'll be successful. The idea that Pete Hegseth, who was fired for mismanagement at two different tiny nonprofits, is capable of running the largest bureaucracy on the face of the planet. If you actually, right, if you said that and you actually hear about the qualifications, people would start laughing, right? Like the idea, it's just absurd. And so putting these people in seems a lot more about being willing to use the organs of the federal government to, for domestic political purposes, or even to go after Trump's enemies, than it is some sense that, like, Kash Patel, of all people on earth, is going to make the FBI a lean, mean, crime-fighting machine.
Well, the counter argument is new blood. Maybe let's get some of the, get some new blood down in Washington, D.C., new ways of thinking.
So I really appreciate you saying that, because that is what both my first two books were about, right? The virtues of new blood and the advantages of bringing people in. So you will find no one on earth who's more positive about the ideas that you can bring in new thinking and make huge changes than me. I believe that. But, right, not all changes are good. There's a famous thing, syllogism, politicians' logic. We must do something, this is something, therefore we must do this, right? And that's not right. There are many, many more ways to break an institution than to fix it. And if you look at the Pentagon, no institution needs massive reform more than the Pentagon. And if you needed to do that, you would ask, say, someone who had deep expertise in running a major procurement program, or someone who really understood the federal bureaucracy. You would not get someone who had, essentially was fired for mismanagement from their last two jobs, right? If you were running. If Apple said they were going to replace Tim Cook with someone like that, you might say, well, Apple could use some fresh thinking, but I'm not sure that's where the fresh thinking is likely to come from.
Okay, well, fresh meat aside, Doge is obviously front and center too. Mm-hmm. We saw Vivek Ramaswamy leaving Doge to maybe go run for governor. The lawyer apparently is leaving Doge. She was there for 72 hours. What are you making of all of these headlines?
So the real thing that happened, and and it is a real distinction between the first Trump administration and the second Trump administration, is the second one seems to be a lot more bureaucratically competent. And so what they essentially did was repurpose the Federal Digital Service, which was created in response to the Obamacare webpage fiasco, to improve the technical capabilities of the federal government. They repurposed that into Doge, which gives Doge access to essentially all of the non-classified information in the federal government, gives it in everywhere. It is a brilliant bureaucratic move, and it suggests that Doge may actually have a lot more impact on the government than we had originally thought it would when it first started looking like kind of essentially a committee that was going to issue a report. The problem there, again, is going back is what we just saw, for example, is a communications freeze, for example, at NIH. So NIH has stopped reviewing all grants. They've stopped working with all scientists. NIH is the foundation for basically all biomedical research, not just in the United States, but really in the entire world. It spends $47.5 billion a year, and biomedical research in the world, things that we rely on to cure diseases, just doesn't happen without NIH. that kind of a freeze does real meaningful harm to scientific research for every day that it goes on. And it seems to have been issued quite capriciously without even any sort of explanation as to why we're doing this or how it makes sense. So that kind of thing is where, if Doge does things like that, I'd be pretty concerned as opposed to, optimistic,
right,
where massive federal government reform is long overdue.
Yep. All right, Gautam, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Gautam Mukunda, professor at the Yale School of Management.
This is the Bloomberg Intelligence Podcast, available on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Listen live each weekday, 10 a.m. to noon Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, TuneIn, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.